Dun 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 dun. This is a TPIMSR Live short report.
So most of you know Mark's not his real name, and he's really not from Anaheim. But anyway, let me give you a little bit of his background. During the early 1990s, Mark from Anaheim joined the legendary Vietnam War veteran David Hackworth and others to present an alternative to the John Birch Society far right-wing agenda being presented on talk radio by the likes of Ollie North and G. Gordon Liddy. Mark is both a retired U.S. Marine Corps Mustang infantry officer and a retired LAPD patrol supervisor. He has provided intelligence briefings to high-ranking U.S. Armed Forces personnel, assisted both at the State of California and the U.S. Department of Defense rewrite police tactics manuals, and he has provided counterterrorism training to U.S. State Department and NATO personnel. Since retiring, Mark has returned to a life, in his words now, as a lazy surfing beach bum, where he spends much of his time coaching and mentoring some of the most successful young female surfers from around the world. Mark from Anaheim, welcome back. Happy New Year, and welcome back to WOL Radio.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Nelson. Bon année.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Bon année. Happy New Year.
Oh, Happy New Year. I couldn't recognize the language.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And I'm, I called you up because of all the stuff that was going on. Because it just seems like the information is just coming rapid fire, and people are all confused of what's going on in Iraq and Iran. So maybe if you can give us some history of the region first.
There's something going on in Iraq and Iran? Dang, nobody tells me anything, man. I'm always out of the loop. I missed Christmas again this year. Well, I guess last year now. But guess what? I'm not broke because I never buy Christmas presents. Well, not many people listening to this show today are broke with property taxes coming and all these new expenses. Gas prices are going up because, as you said, things are going on in Iraq and Iran. And they went out and spent all that money on worthless crap during the Thanksgiving, Christmas holidays. But before we get started today, I just want the listeners to know, yesterday was my 43rd Marine Corps anniversary. Well, actually, I celebrated my, 42nd. 43 years ago is when I actually swore in, but so I guess that would be my 42nd anniversary. And I'd like to dedicate this show to those who look as I, who came before I did, who paved the way for those of us who, later wore the uniform. And my comments today are solely my own opinions. I'm not representing any present or former U.S. government agency. And I know a lot of folks have questions regarding Iraq, Iran, etc. There may be some questions with the callers posed, which I'll probably decline to answer for national security reasons. There's a lot going on right now, as you alluded to, Mr. Nelson. I really find it repugnant how many people out there considering themselves so-called experts on radio, television, and in print media too. They seem to feel as if they can just come out and say whatever they want, and with total disregard for the safety of our U.S. personnel if they end up having to be called up and be deployed, regardless of how we feel about the situation. It seems a little reckless and unprofessional for some of those people who were former individuals wearing the uniform that are now out there telling the whole world what the U.S. could do, what the U.S. might do. So for those who have never heard me before, as I always say when I appear on these radio shows, don't believe anything I tell you today. I want you to do your own research, make up your own minds. However, Mr. Nelson will attest to the fact that after more than 2 decades, he and I have been doing radio shows together. I've never had anybody honestly claim that I've ever lied to you, provided disinformation, or provided misinformation. So with that, Mr. Nelson, let's get started. We call it today Iran. Up until the 1930s, though, it was known as Persia. And I know a lot of people use the term in the Middle East. Personally, me, because you and I have been doing shows since the 90s, I detest that term Middle East, and I refuse to call it that. I call it Africa. And building a damn Suez Canal to break off that portion of the continent of Africa does not mean it's still not Africa. So you didn't really have the term the Middle East that became a household term around the world until after the British. It's always the British. The sun shall never set on the British Empire. And you had a man by the name of Percy Zachariah Cox. When his troops settled in the southwest region of Iran back in the early 1900s, So, Mr. Nelson, I'm sure you're familiar with, we had the Gulf oil spill. Remember that tragedy?
Right. Remember that?
Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, still suffering from that. And what company was it involved with the Gulf oil spill?
BP?
BP. No, not black people. British Petroleum. Now, you know, we're out here in California. So in California, most people know it as Arco gas. Well, in 1908, oil was discovered in the southwest region of Iran. And so what you know is BP today was originally called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In fact, it was the first time that oil was ever extracted from Persia, or / Iran as we know it today. And in 1935, as Persia was now being referred to as Iran, we come back from the break, I'll update you on where that Anglo-Persian Oil Company went and how it has an impact on what happened this past, weekend.
All right. 800-450-7876 to speak to Mark. Your calls after this short break on 1450.
News. And now back to the Carl Nelson Show.
On Washington, D.C.'s 1450.
1450 WOL Radio.
And thanks for rolling with us, folks. Our guest is Mark from Anaheim. We're going to discuss the strike, the drone strike here on Iraq. A number to call to speak to Mark, 800-450-7876. If you're listening to us online, just tell folks that Mark from Anaheim's on the radio. They, too, can listen at WOLDCnews.com. Because, Mark, you still in Facebook jail? Or they released you yet?
I'm actually been released from Facebook jail, but very interesting. Of course, last Thursday when you and I had a conversation and you dragged me out of trying to remain in obscurity to come back on this show today, within minutes, of course, I came under cyber attack as soon as I finally agreed to do the show with you. But it's interesting because Facebook is doing some serious purging now. I'm constantly getting messages from Facebook telling me I'm in violation of their community standards. And I'm like, okay, what have I done this time? And what they're doing now is going through photographs that I've had on Facebook for years and are now claiming these photographs violate their policy. And the thing about it is, these photographs are simply photographs that I have posted of individuals who were part of the Nazi regime back during World War II. And all I have is the photograph and the name of the individual. I don't even say anything about their political positions. I don't give any of my personal opinions about them. I just post these so people can go back and do research and realize a lot of what's going on in this country today is not new, because much of what's happening in the U.S. today is very similar to what was going on to the Weimar Republic back in the 1930s. But Facebook, and I'm not the only one. I've had several people contact me and tell me the same thing. They simply have photographs of individual. Well, one guy last week, he had posted a photograph of Mussolini and Hitler in the backseat of a convertible. Didn't post any comments with it, and he was immediately told that photograph violated the community standards. So what I'm noticing with Facebook now, it appears to be as if they're purging any history that people might be able to tie in to what's similar to what's going on with the Trump administration. But so far, at least in the last couple of weeks now, I have not been in jail. But you could talk. Are you out of Facebook jail yet?
I think I am. I
think I am.
Well, it's hard to say because they throttled me for so long, and then.
Well, I'm still throttled. Oh, please, no. In fact, I have people, some close friends from my past who. Where have you been? I haven't seen you post anything lately. And I tell them I'm not anywhere. I'm right here. Is that when you're being throttled, they also don't necessarily send your news feeds to individuals who used to regularly read what you had posted. So unless you contact that individual directly, they don't even know you're still on Facebook. They think you've taken a vacation or something. But let's proceed. So. Listeners out there, I know there's a lot of research warriors, so let me say this slowly again. The individual's name, back in the early 1900s, in the southwest region of Iran, his name was Percy Zachariah Cox. Now, he was a British general. If you all ever want to know, I mean, it's amazing, Mr. Nuts, you can't ever lay everything at the foot of one individual, but if there was one major player from the British government that was responsible for so much calamity and so much that still is going on in the so-called Middle East, which I refuse to use that term. I call it Africa. It is Percy Zachariah Cox. He was in bed with the Wahhabite Saudis. He was in bed with replacing all the Palestinians with Jews who were not from Israel, but coming from Europe and the United States. He was behind so much that was involved with the Balfour Declaration. I mean, I can go on and on. So folks out there, if you want an idea of how we got to where we are today in the mass confusion, that's the name to research, Percy Zachariah Cox. Now, in 1908, as I said earlier before the break, oil was found in that region, and the company that was created was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. But by 1935, the ruling religious leaders of of Iran, they didn't want to be called Persia anymore, so they renamed it basically in 1935 to Iran. And when they changed the name of Persia to Iran in 1935, they also changed the name of the oil company to from Anglo-Persian Oil Company to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So, folks, as you know, today BP, as Mr. Nelson, is British Petroleum. It was never called BP until 1954. So that's just a little history, just to touch a little history on that. And I say 1954, Mr. Nelson, because that was a very significant year. Are you familiar with Operation Ajax, Mr. Nelson?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, right. See, Mr. Nelson is cool, folks. Mr. Nelson is one of the most knowledgeable individuals I've ever come in contact with. But his job is to make sure that the host is the one on the hot seat, so he's going to play ignorant. And what you have basically is an individual, his name was Mohammed Mossadegh. Now, up until, from the earliest, when the oil was discovered in Persia, now Iran, it's amazing how the British cut this deal where a whopping 16% of the profits gained from the oil in Persia/Iran went to the Iranians, and then 74% of the actually 84% of the profits went to outsiders. So, in 1954, Mohammed Mossadegh was democratically elected as the Prime Minister of Iran, and from 1951 to 1953, he served as Prime Minister. Now, he resisted both secular rule and foreign interference during that time. He was more of a nationalist. And during that period, he tried to implement programs that were similar to our Social Security program here in the United States. He did a lot of land reform, higher taxes on outsiders that were using Iranian land for their own professional and personal use. Well, you know, Mr. Nelson, that didn't go over too well with the Brits or the Brits' cousins over across the pond in the U.S. Now, we just finished World War II earlier, and the Cold War had heated up. So we're talking the early 1950s, and MI6, along with the United States OSS, which had now become CIA. CIA was in their infancy stages of life. So British intelligence, U.S. intelligence began spreading propaganda over in Iran about Mossadegh being a communist. You know, kind of like what they did to Franklin Delano Roosevelt when they tried to do a coup on Roosevelt here in the U.S., or calling Barack Hussein Obama a communist, calling Bernie Sanders a communist, you know. Now, the John Birch Society hadn't really been founded yet, Mr. Nelson, but a lot of these players later on became members of the formal John Birch Society. So what you had is Mossadegh ended up resigning in 1953 after a failed coup attempt. And during that failed coup attempt in 1953, based on the propaganda of communism spread throughout the media and leaflets being tossed around the country by British and U.S. intelligence, the Shah of Iran, he fled to Baghdad, but he still had the power to dismiss Mossadegh as the prime minister. And what he did was appointed an individual who was actually backed by British and U.S. intelligence, and that was a General Zahedi. So Zahedi was prime minister of Iran when Mossadegh was taken out. And I mentioned Operation Ajax, Mr. Nelson, because, since I did mention FDR earlier, one of FDR's relatives, Kermit Roosevelt, he was one of the old SS boys, CIA now, that headed up that whole program of Operation Ajax to overthrow Mossadegh over in Iran. And it's interesting because Zahedi, who became prime minister in 1953, he was actually involved in the overthrow of the government back in the 1920s, so he was no foreign, coup d'etats was not foreign to him. And he served from 1953 to 1955. So basically, you have the Shah of Iran now, who has fled to Baghdad, but still wielding power from the monarchy's point of view. And while many of his detractors saw him as being weak, he was already planning on not only reigning as a monarch, but also ruling, similar to what you would have in the powers of a prime minister. So unlike in the UK today, where you might see the royal family, but they don't really supposedly get involved actively with the politics. Of course, they have people who influence the politics, but you don't see the king or the queen making decisions directly. It's done through parliament. That's how Iran was similar to, but Shah of Iran had different ideas. So even in 1958, there was a coup attempt against the Shah by British and U.S. intelligence because they thought the Shah was being a little too cozy to Soviet Union. Then when he upset the Soviet Union, there were assassination attempts, and he was targeted for assassination by the Soviet Union. But in spite of all that, the Shah survived, and he had himself formally crowned as the king of Iran back in 1967. And he basically reigned until 1979, Mr. Nelson, when he had to leave after this, what they call the Islamic Revolution, that basically culminated in him being forced to leave office at the end of 1978. But in January 1979 is when he and his family formally left Iran. And, a lot of people have, good things, bad things to say about him. Mr. Nelson, if you're not aware of it, for the listeners out there, I'm here in Southern California. There is no place outside of Iran that has a larger population of Iranians/Persians than Southern California, especially in the Los Angeles area. And I remember when the Shah had a big mansion here in Beverly Hills. I used to hang out in the park right across the street from that mansion. There used to be protesters out there all the time. And yeah, he was barbaric and he had the savak, but he also had the highest death penalty of any country in the world during his reign. But at the same time, he did try to institute programs to modernize Iran. He was hoping to compare Iran to Europe, if not just the United States, and how modern they had become. If I get a little trivia for you, Mr. Nelson, he was hoping to host the 1984 Summer Olympics in Iran. And who got those 1984 Summer Olympics, Mr. Nelson?
L.A.
Well, L.A. was supposed to actually get the Olympics in 1980. But since we had so many serial murders out here in California at the time, Hillside Strangler, Bonin, and they were unsolved serial murders, they refused to give LA the contract for the Olympics in 1980. So when we come back from the break, we'll get into a little bit more modern history up until the drone strikes.
All right, 800-450-7876. Speak to Mark. Your calls after the short break on 1450.
And now back to the Carl Nelson Show.
On Washington, D.C.'s 1450.
1450 WOL Radio.
Thanks for staying with us, folks. Our guest is Mark from Anaheim, and we're discussing the attack on Iraq, the drone attack. So Mark is giving us some background, some history of the region before we get into what happened last week. So Mark, I'll let you continue your story.
So before the first break, I reminded the folks the name to write down if you want to do some further research was Percy Zachariah Cox, C-O-X. And before this last break, I gave you another name, Kermit Roosevelt. Anybody out there who wants to really have an idea what's going on in Iran today, you would have to know what the role was of individuals like Percy Cox and Kermit Roosevelt. And what I was saying before the break was how the Shah had his problems, and he was ruthless in certain ways, but at the same time, he did try to modernize Iran. I mean, people were wearing blue jeans in Iran before he left, right? And he was hoping to bring the Olympics to Iran by 1984, the Summer Olympics, which L.A. got, of course. In fact, Mr. Nelson, this past weekend, I was down in Belmont Shores, Long Beach for a sailing event, which was right next door to the Olympic pools down there. So, here in L.A., you still have remnants from the 1984 Olympics with the pools in La Mirada, pool over in Fullerton, California, pool over in Long Beach, a pool, another one, I can think of them right now. But the reason I'm saying that to you, because, I came on your show, Mr. Nelson, like 2 years ago and told you how when the United States, Los Angeles area was told they're going to get the Olympics in 2024. Remember that?
Right.
and I reminded your listeners that when we had the Olympics here in 1984, it wasn't only in Los Angeles. It was also in parts of it was in LA County, Orange County, Ventura County. And if you want to see what cities are going to try to vie to get a piece of those Olympics, just see the cities that are going after the homeless. And since I did that show with you, Mr. Nelson, places like Anaheim, where they had literally hundreds of homeless people living along the Santa Ana River next to Angel Stadium, that's all gone now. Venice is being cleaned up. So certain areas that want to get part of that Olympics, it's amazing how now you've seen them in the news over and over again. But I digress. So what I'm telling you is when the Shah left in January of 79, he went to several countries. You know, it's interesting to Mr. I still have a videotape of Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter, where he was visiting and having a toast and talking about the good relationship he had with the people of Iran. And several weeks later, they had the major coup in Iran. So, you know, it's like Jimmy Carter didn't even see it coming. At least that's what people would like you to believe. But the Shah had fled in January of 79 and went to several different countries trying to get exile. And finally, who ended up giving him exile, Mr. Nelson?
Who ended up getting exile?
Who gave exile who allowed him to stay in the country in exile?
Oh, I don't know.
Jimmy Carter, United States. Now, that's interesting because, you know, years have gone by and certain things have been declassified, and depending on who you talk to, there are certain people, Mr. Nelson, who will tell you that it was actually the Carter administration that helped the Ayatollah Khomeini return to Iran by preventing the Iranian army from launching a military coup. And supposedly the Ayatollah had told the United States while he was in exile in France that don't worry, the United States will still be able to get their oil from Iran once he becomes the head mullah. Now, I've come on this show before, Mr. Nelson, to talk to your listeners about the fact how the Shah of Iran was taken out and the Ayatollah came back when he was actually living in France. And I know you had some person call into the show. I don't know who this guy is, but I was in Paris with him the day before he went to France. And I'm like, you just confirmed what I said. Okay. I have you a question, Mr. Nelson. Where was Dick Gregory when all this was going on?
Dick Gregory was over there trying to figure out how to get out. He made it out before they closed the gates.
Yeah. See, because this drone strike took place in what year, Mr. Nelson?
Which one? The one that just took place last week?
Yeah.
2020.
Was it 2020? Barely, right? Which reminds me, are we in a new decade?
Well, you know, where you go there.
That was a yes or no question, Mr. Nelson.
I was just going to say, some people say
yes
no.
or no. Thank you.
No.
You hear that, folks? Stop repeating see, this is how they dumb you down. It's not a new decade until 2021. And I even hear these official news stations like KFI and everybody else talking about the baby that was the first baby born in the new year and the new decade. It is not a new decade unless the first year on this planet was 0. The first year on the planet was 1. So until we get to the next 1, we don't start another decade. We're just so dumbed down. And people repeat the dumbed down lies over and over again. So, and that's the only reason Mr. Nelson was able to talk to me on the show, because it didn't take long. And Mr. Nelson, I just asked you to attest to this. When you and I had the conversation on Thursday, shortly after that drone attack, did I not tell you the first thing you're going to see is Parliament voting to tell the U.S. to get out of the country?
Right. Yes, you did.
So let's dispel some myths here, okay? 1, we had the so-called major protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, in Iraq. And what did that sound like to you, Mr. Nelson?
What did it sound like? Protest?
Yeah, what did it remind you of from 40 years ago?
What happened before?
At the U.S. Embassy in Iran, right?
Right.
Now, I found the whole thing peculiar because this big protest is going on outside the U.S. Embassy, and where was the ambassador for the U.S.?
Pardon me?
He just happened to be out of town on vacation, so if anything went down, he wouldn't be caught in the... See, a lot of folks don't know this about the Iran. When the embassy in Iran was taken in 1979, those who were protesting had no intentions of being able to take over the embassy. They were protesting outside. They jumped over the fences, and they thought they were going to be shot and go to heaven because they had died for Allah. But they jumped over the fences, and nobody shot them because the ambassador inside the embassy told the Marines to stand down. So they went a little bit further. Nobody shot them. They went a little further. Nobody shot them. They're inside. Nobody's shooting them. Mr. Nelson, to this day, we have no idea how many legitimate passports were created because the passport papers or in the safes were collected by these protesters. Because one of your little John Birch Society boys that was over in that area told them to stand down. All right? Now, the biggest scandal that happened during the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra scandal, was it not?
Right. I just had to confirm some folks that misconstrued. They thought you were questioning where Dick Gregory was. I had to remind them that we were on the air when we were doing an interview with Greg when the hostages were taken, and we had to tell Greg actually to get out of Iran.
I know.
So.
I know, see, Mr. Nelson, I'm like a lawyer. When I ask a question, I already know the answer, okay?
I get it. But some people not hearing correctly, so I just want to correct them so that you know that
so
you knew where Greg
let me
was.
speak more slowly.
Okay.
I asked Mr. Nelson, where was Dick Gregory at the time? I already knew where Dick Gregory was because Dick Gregory was being interviewed by Carl Nelson. Dick Gregory was not even aware that the embassy had been taken over and now they were hunting down anybody who appeared to be a U.S. citizen over in Iran at the time. And it was Mr. Nelson and others who had to warn Dick Gregory he needed to get out of there. Did I say that correctly, Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, I guess they get it now. They're not hearing correctly, so I think they got it now.
Okay, so what ended up happening anyway, so when you look at that coup that happened in 1979, I saw flashbacks to that. It appeared to me that they were trying to do something similar to really get the U.S. population all riled up by having these individuals force their way inside that embassy over there in Baghdad and have the same thing. Well, anyway, remember Mr. Nelson? But Donald Trump came through and he showed strength because what did he do? He had 100 Marines. Most of the Marines, by the way, are from 29 Palms and Camp Pendleton out there. I run Facebook sites for those. And these Marines went to the embassy and the protesters fled, right?
Right.
No. Most of those protesters were long gone before those Marines ever got there because what really happened was the protesters are outside the embassy and they were demanding that the United States pull out of Iraq because those people were tired of the United States using Iraq as a base to keep an eye on Iran. And the leaders, the local leaders in the area said, listen, we hear your complaints. And this is what we're going to do. We'll present your complaints to Parliament, and we'll have a vote on it. And when the people were satisfied that their complaints were being held, the protesters left. It had nothing to do with these Marines coming to the embassy and Donald Trump coming through as Superman. There you go, folks. That's the truth. And I told this to Mr. Nelson on Thursday evening. And this past weekend, what did Parliament do? They voted on a referendum demanding that the United States pulls out. Now, let me tell you all the second big lie you've heard. Well, there's some other, but big lie. This is a non-binding vote. Not true, folks. Now, over in Iran, since they try to be similar to the United States and other places, yes, Parliament can vote on something, but the president here in the United States would have to ratify it if Congress voted on something. And similarly in Iran, if the Parliament votes on something, the Prime Minister has to ratify it. So normally you would consider it non-binding until it was signed by the Prime Minister. However, folks, allow me to tell you what really happened this past weekend. It was the Prime Minister who introduced it to the Parliament, so it's binding. So when we get back from the break, folks, thank you for your patience, but I had to put this out there to give you all the base of where we're headed, and I will tell you some things that you probably have not heard that would really happen this past week.
All right, 800-450-7876. Speak to Mark. Your calls after the show.
Shelving. And with easy in-store returns, you can bring it back if you ever build one yourself. Save up to 30% on select storage pieces, plus enjoy free and
Back to the Carl Nelson Show.
On Washington, D.C.'s 1450.
1450 WOL Radio.
Thanks for staying with us, folks. I guess it's Mark from Anaheim. We'll get back to Mark in a moment. Let me just tell some of the other folks who are going to be stopping by in the next few days. You're going to hear from our coach, our very own coach, Butch McAdams. Is going to talk about the playoffs. We're going to see if we're going to, he's going to guess if we're going to have a black quarterback in the Super Bowl. A lot of black quarterbacks in the playoffs. Also, the Rooney Rule, if that's going to play out too. There's a lot of NFL coaching slots that are open, and with that coaching carousel keeps rolling around. So far, none of our folks got picked yet, so coach is going to give us an update. Also, Sister Ava Mohammed, she's the legal representative for the Nation of Islam, and also Minister Farrakhan will be with us. Neely Fuller Jr., Dr. Francis Cress Welsing's mentor, is going to be here as well. Also, black politics expert, Dr. James Taylor, teaches at UC San Francisco and UC Berkeley. And he's going to tell us about what's going on with the impeachment process for Donald Trump. And Brother Keaty is going to hear and tell us about investments in Africa. So if you're in the DMV, tell your friends to keep their radios locked on 1450 WOL, where information is power. So, Mark, I'm going to let you finish up what you were saying.
The two big powers over in that region, Mr. Nelson, are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they definitely have their major differences. Most of us is probably exasperated by their religious differences. For those who don't know, the two main branches of Islam, of course, Iran is largely Shia Muslim, while Saudi Arabia is the leading Sunni Muslim power. Now, historically, Saudi Arabia is considered the birthplace of Islam, and Saudi Arabia was seen as the leader of the Muslim world. However, this all changed after the Islamic Revolution in Iran back in 1979. And since 1979, you've seen Iran taking much more of a lead in exporting their theocratic type of revolutionary form of government in the region. Now, I say this to you, Mr. Nelson, because those two powers have to be thought of as enemies, kind of like Israel is surrounded on all sides by enemies. Because as long as Saudi Arabia and Iran are seen as enemies, and as long as Israel is surrounded on all sides by enemies, what does that allow for the United States and Great Britain?
They got some friends in the region.
They have some friends in the region, and you have, unlike what people want to believe, it wasn't Dwight D. Eisenhower who said military-industrial complex. He said the military-industrial congressional complex, but the congressional was taken out before people heard the speech. And Eisenhower could be touted as some of this great guy, but it was Eisenhower, Mr. Nelson, who, we have a saying in the spook community, when the Marines are too noisy, you call upon the men of CIA. And back up until like the year 2016, within CIA, we have an organization called the Special Activities Division. And the motto of Special Activities Division is third option. Now, that term, I'm very familiar with that term because you had a guy named Theodore Shackley, a.k.a. the Blonde Ghost. He authored a book called The Third Option. So, folks, here's number 3 for you. Percy Cox, Kermit Roosevelt, and now Theodore Shackley, S-H-A-C-K-L-E-Y, Theodore Shackley, Ted Shackley, the Blonde Ghost. You guys do some research in those 3 names, and you'll know far more than what these average idiots are telling you on media right now. And within Special Activities Division, you have 2 groups. You have the Special Operations Group, and then you have the Political Action Group. So, I'm still calling them Special Activity Division, but then I'll call them Special Activity Center. I'm sorry. Now, I'm not going to get into any specific details on what Special Operation Group does or the Political Action Group, but I think from just those 2 names, you get an idea. It's super secret, and they're behind the scenes to help, let's say, foment environments for regime change or political discourse and unrest in certain areas. Now, Mr. Nelson, we've been talking about alluding to this drone strike, and a lot of people keep saying, they keep repeating this lie that General Soleimani, who was only one of several people killed there, but he's the only one we mentioned. But Soleimani was the number 2 man in Iran. Have you been hearing that, Mr. Nelson?
Yeah.
Well, isn't Iran led by a religious leader?
Right.
Was Soleimani a religious leader?
I don't think so. Never heard it.
Then how the hell would he be the number 2 man in Iran? So, folks, please, when you start hearing the media, start using your own brains. Because I doubt, seriously, anybody who's listening to me right now don't know enough to already know that it's a theocratic, which means it's run in a religious fashion. So he might be a general, and yeah, he might be important, and he might be high-ranking, but he was not the person next in line to take over if the religious leader of Iran right now was to die. So that does not make him the number 2 person. Now, I just told you about a Special Activities Center. If I was going to compare Soleimani to who he might be equal to in the United States, he would have been equal to the person who's in charge of Special Activities Center, Special Operations Group. That's what he would be comparable. Not all this other crap you folks have been hearing. That doesn't mean he wouldn't be a key figure. Don't get me wrong. However, what I will also tell you is Soleimani was not corrupt like many of the leaders in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. He was very popular in Iran, but he had his enemies. Hell, he's got a lot of enemies right here in the U.S. who are happy to see him dead. But here's the kicker, Mr. Nelson. I just told your listeners that Saudi Arabia and Iran are the 2 big players in the region. Notice I didn't mention Israel. I said Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they've hated each other for years. Well, a lot of that hate, Mr. Nelson, was generated by those who have to see these 2 people hate each other. I have it on good, reliable source that Soleimani, Mr. Nelson, was actually in Iraq brokering a deal to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran closer together. Stop the hate. And that's when he was taken up.
So somebody wants to start a war, and they're using that? Is it?
I didn't say start a war. What I'm saying is Saudi Arabia and Iran would now become allies instead of enemies. We can't have that. How are we going to justify having all those troops over there? How are we going to justify the military-industrial congressional complex making billions of dollars? Mr. Nelson, did you even know that 48 hours before that drone strike, there were certain defense contractors where people were buying up stocks?
No.
I guess you do now, huh?
Surprised. Right.
So that means there are certain individuals in Congress and other places who already knew this was going to happen. While they're they're like the guy in the movie Casablanca. I'm shocked. They're not shocked, Mr. Nelson. These guys they were already doing inside trading to buy stocks of certain defense contractors whose stocks went up. So while the price of gas went up, so did the value of stocks in certain defense contractors. So I hope that helps a little bit to explain a little bit of the history of. I know I really did we don't have much time, and this is really a complex subject. But that's a little bit idea of where Persia came, Iran, British Petroleum, MI6, OSS/CIA, Kermit Roosevelt, Percy Cox, Balfour Declaration that brought Israel into this whole thing, because before Balfour Declaration, Muslim, Jews, and Christians got along just fine in Israel. There are always outsiders that come in and stir up the pot, get everybody to fight each other, and then they come in and clean up on the spoils of war. So
let me ask you this question, though, because they said that Barack Obama and W could have taken him out, and they resisted because they knew what the problems it would cause.
Okay, now let's not BS other people. President George W. Bush or President Barack Hussein Obama could have ordered the murder or assassination. Don't start using these colloquial terms like take him out, because then it doesn't sound like what it really is. Because that's what it is. Murder. Yes, they could have murdered him But let me explain something to you, Mr. Nelson. Were we not at war against the Taliban? Or supposedly against the war with Taliban? Because I'm not sure since we're guarding the poppy fields now over in Afghanistan, but were we not at war against the Taliban?
That's what they told us.
Do you want to know who one of our greatest allies was in the region during that war against the Taliban?
Who?
General Soleimani.
Hmm.
You hearing me, folks? Soleimani worked with us against the Taliban. Soleimani, I just told you, is comparable to our person in charge of our Special Activities Section Special Operations Group. That means he's highly trained. That means he's been trained with and by us. That means he knows the players, and now he's a threat because he was brokering a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to knock off their foolishness over their Muslim religious differences. Could I be any more plain, Mr. Nelson?
Mm-hmm. So somebody wants the feud to go on.
Hell yeah! You can't, Mr. Nelson. If we don't have crime, how are you going to justify hiring more cops? If you have peace, how are you going to justify this bloated defense budget that Nancy Pelosi and everybody pretends how they so? Mr. Nelson, when AOC, who I'm not a fan of, but when AOC and these other folks got elected to Congress, the last person they wanted as Speaker of the House was who?
The last person they wanted?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
They did not want Nancy Pelosi, did they?
Well, 45 did.
No. See, you don't answer the question. My point to you is the Democrats and these progressives, they did not
they were
want
opposed
Nancy Pelosi.
Right. They were opposed.
And when Nancy Pelosi still got selected over their protest, the first person who was jumping up and down and dancing was Donald J. Trump.
Right.
Folks, you're being had. Nancy Pelosi didn't impeach Trump. Nancy Pelosi quieted down the progressives to shut them up until the holidays were over. And she still hasn't walked across the hall and handed the impeachment papers to McConnell. Now, folks, we are on day number 19. McConnell has already introduced legislation that if Nancy Pelosi doesn't bring those papers by day 25, they're not even going to entertain an impeachment hearing. She's only got 6 more days. She's only got 6 more days.
All right, hold that thought. We got to take a short break as we're closing on the top of the hour so some of our stations can identify themselves down the line. Stations like 1450 WOL, where information is power.
Thank you all for watching. Please join me on Patreon, where you'll find exclusive material. You can join for just as little as $1 or just as much as 1,000. The choice is yours. Peace and power.